But there's a even harder problem of consciousness, which I want to talk about today. Materialism is not only wrong, it's conceptually incoherent. I was at a small liberal arts college called St. John's College,
Hmm.
um, and it was founded by, well, it's an old college actually, but the liberal arts program was founded by Jacob Klein,
Hmm.
who was a student in Germany of Edmund Husserl.
Hmm.
So he was steeped in that Kantian tradition,
Hmm.
and um, he had a deep appreciation for the consciousness-based framework. Now,
Hmm.
when I was an undergraduate, so I was a double major philosophy and mathematics,
Hmm.
but I didn't fully understand or appreciate what he was trying to do with the liberal arts and the foundations of Western civilization, really,
Hmm.
and the importance of this tradition, which is very prominent in Germany and has its roots. There were a number of influential thinkers, but Immanuel Kant was the most important.
Hmm.
And I speak a little bit about Kant in
Hmm.
my lecture. So if you'd like, I
Yeah,
can
yeah, we're
start.
looking forward to your lecture, and I'm allowed to ask questions if I don't understand.
Yes, ask questions anytime.
Mhm.
Now, I have to warn you, my lecture is goes on and on to infinity. So we just have to stop it when you get tired,
Okay, good.
because otherwise I will speak forever.
Hmm.
Okay, so here, let me share. Now, if I can slideshow, I can do from the beginning. Can you see it okay?
That's perfect.
Okay, so I am, as Eckhart introduced me, I'm the professor and chairman of the Department of Physics, and I am the director of the Institute for Physics, Consciousness, and Veda. Um, and the title of my talk is Two Dogmas of Materialism, Bridging Science, Philosophy, and Vedic Perspectives. So, for centuries, physics has operated under the assumption, born of pragmatic decisions in the 17th century, that consciousness and mind are irrelevant to understanding the material world. Now, this came from the great geniuses who founded modern science, Galileo, Rene Descartes. And at that time, the church was introducing a priori assumptions about the way the world was, that the earth is the center of the universe and that the sun and the moon and the planets all revolve around the earth. And they were ignoring the accumulating evidence from Copernicus and Galileo. Galileo was actually put under house arrest and forced to recant the idea that the earth revolved around the sun. So, what some of those early scientists said was, okay, the domain of mind and consciousness, that is the spiritual domain. And the material domain we can study with empirical methods, and let's keep those separate. And so materialism actually hardened into its own kind of quasi-religious dogma by the end of the 1800s. It was even underpinning uh, Karl Marx's political philosophy and the rejection of a spiritual foundation and traditional values. But let's not get into politics. Let's stick with the scientific ramifications. Materialism is the idea that consciousness and mind are just passive byproducts. Passive means the mind doesn't have any causal efficacy of its own. It's just a byproduct of neurons firing in the brain. And that those neurons firing in the brain produce consciousness and cognition. That's what I'll call the production model, that the brain produces consciousness. And we'll contrast that with what William James called the transmission model, which the brain doesn't produce consciousness or mind, but it picks up the signal like the radio picks up the transmissions from the radio tower and transduces that energy into the form that we are familiar with. So the whatever the broadcast is, music or commentary or whatever, that exists independently of the radio receiver, and the radio receiver picks up that transmission. So William James and his colleague Frederick Myers called that the transmission model. And it turns out that I believe Maharishi has a very sophisticated form of the transmission model. In the third lecture, after learning transcendental meditation, Maharishi uses the analogy of the sun. The sun shines everywhere the same, but different nervous systems, like different glasses of water, one with green water, one with brown water, one with clear water, will pick up the reflection of the sun, and it will be more or less pure and accurate depending on the quality of the water. Like that, the nervous system picks up the transmission of consciousness and mind. And in the Vedic tradition, mind is part of the subtle body. And we'll see that that makes sense, because whereas the materialist likes to think that mind and consciousness are causally irrelevant, that they don't have any efficacy of their own, it's significant that in the Vedic tradition, mind, actually prana, mind, intellect, ego, are all part of what's called the subtle body. Body, because they do have a physical manifestation. They are causally efficacious in the physical world. Now, that is a physics question. How does the mind exchange energy and information with the brain? That's a physics problem. And at MIU, that is the focus of our research. So, if Eckert will allow me to give an advertisement for MIU's graduate physics program. If you would like to study physics from the consciousness-based perspective, MIU is the place to do it. We have a graduate program in place, both on campus and online, distance education, online, asynchronous. And we're very student friendly. What's most important for fundamental physics is being able to think for yourself, to be able to think outside the box. And it's in this sense that freeing ourselves from this materialist um, constraints, materialism has become kind of a religious dogma. I mean, it's an atheism, but kind of a quasi religious dogma in its own right. It has answers to all the big questions, and it turns out that its answers are wrong. And in the 17th century, Descartes and Galileo thought it was harmless to treat matter as if it could be studied independent of consciousness and anything spiritual. But it's not innocent anymore because advanced physics is probing beyond the assumptions that uphold the materialist paradigm, our waking state assumptions about how space, time, matter, and causation work. While this view enabled remarkable progress in science, the idea that the material world could be studied independently of consciousness, it has now become a limiting paradigm. Theoretical physics has seen no major breakthroughs in over half a century since the discovery of the quark model in the 1970s. And the materialist framework is beginning to crack under the weight of its own anomalies, from non-locality and quantum entanglement to retrocausality, the Aharonov-Bohm effect. If time allows, I'll talk about all of these things, and the role of virtual particles and global constraints in Lagrangian and quantum field theory. These adynamical phenomena hint at a subtler layer of reality, what the Vedic tradition calls the subtle domain, or subtle matter, or subtle body, whose most accessible expression is prana, the life force. Deeper than prana is mind, deeper than mind is intellect, and the finest level of intellect is finest feeling, and then beyond the intellect is ego. Prana acts as a global constraint on the coherence and resilience of living systems. To move forward, science needs a new paradigm, one that recognizes consciousness not as a passive epiphenomenon. Epiphenomenon means passive byproduct. It doesn't have any causal power. Thought doesn't have any causal power according to the materialist, but as the fundamental ground of reality. This emerging view, the consciousness-based view, holds promise not only for theoretical physics, but also for experimental discovery, particularly in the frontier fields of biophysics and subtle energy research. Now let's go back to the Katha Upanishad and the story of Nachiketas and Yama. Nachiketas, here he's pictured when he grew up, he became close friends with Yama. Here he is as a young man. But when Nachiketas was just 12 years old, a boy, his father was making offerings to the gods. And Nachiketas noticed that his father was giving the moldy crops and the milk that had already spoiled, and Nachiketas was worried that his father was going to get into trouble. And so Nachiketas said, perhaps not so subtly, "To whom will you offer me?" And his father realized that Nachiketas was giving him a hint that the best things is what he should be offering. And his father was furious with Nachiketas. And what he literally said was, I offer you to Yama, go to Yama. Now, the English translation would be go to hell, not too subtle. I'm not sure what it is in German, but anyway, his father said, go to Yama. So Nachiketus, being a dutiful son, packed up a little satchel and he went looking for Yama. He heard that Yama lived in the south of India somewhere, so he traveled for days and weeks turned into months. And finally, he arrived at Yama's house in the south of India. And he knocked on the door, and the servant came and said, oh, Yama is not at home. Just sit and wait. And so Nachiketa sat on the stoop there in front of the front door and waited for 3 days. And then in the distance, he saw Yama coming on his water buffalo, which was Yama's preferred mode of transportation. And Yama got closer and closer. And when Yama saw the boy on his front step and heard that the servant had asked him to sit and wait for 3 days, Yama was very upset and he said, oh, I'm so sorry. We try to be more hospitable to our guests. Here, I give you 3 wishes, anything you want, and I will try to fulfill them. So Nachiketa said, well, my first wish is that when I go home, my father and I are reconciled and my father is not angry. And Yama said, yes, it's done. Your father will be so relieved to see you. Everything will be fine. And what's your second wish? And Nachiketa said, my second wish is to learn the fire ceremony, which I hear enhances evolution by many fold. And Nachiketas taught him the puja, what we think of as the puja. And Yama said, what's your third wish? And Nachiketa said, well, I'd like to know what happens to us when we die, when the body is dropped and we no longer need it. Do we just merge with the dust and the wind and that's the end of us? Or do we go on? And Yama said, oh, choose something else. This is a very hard question for a young boy. Even the wise have trouble with this question. And why don't you can have wealth, you can have lots of gold, you can have a beautiful wife or many beautiful wives. No, and Nachiketa said, no, 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 no. I really want to know the answer to this question. So Yama proceeded to tell him, and so my aspiration for this lecture is based on all that we know from the Vedas and from science to try to reproduce Yama's answer to Nachiketas. Well, let's talk about the psyche or soul. It's actually psyche is from breath, the principle of life. It's an ancient word, a Greek word. Soul is from sawal in Old English, is the intellectual or immortal principle in a person. So that's the tradition of our English word for psyche or soul. The Vedic concepts are jiva is the individual soul that animates a living being. Jiva is a reflection or manifestation of Atman. Atman is the universal soul, I, the self. But we experience that self and assign it an individual interpretation as our own personal soul. Atman is the universal, eternal, and unchanging self or soul beyond the limitations of time, space, and causality. Brahman is the totality, the ultimate reality underlying all that there is. Now, in the Vedic tradition, and it turns out in the Greek tradition, there's also this chariot metaphor, and this is from the Mahabharata. Arjuna is the warrior, and Krishna is his charioteer, the driver. The chariot represents the body, the driver is the intellect, the reins are the mind, and the horses are the five senses. Now, the artist took a little bit of liberty here. He thought five horses would crowd the picture too much, but there's supposed to be five horses. Now, there's the gross level, the gross material level, which the materialist thinks is the ultimate reality. But there's also the transcendental level, which we experience when we meditate, and we experience as ourself. But mediating between the gross and the transcendental is the subtle domain, which turns out to be a rich, rich domain. And in the Katha Upanishad, this subtle domain is described in terms of the five sheaths surrounding Atma. Annamaya kosha. Anna means food. In fact, the cafeteria at Maharishi International University here in Fairfield, Iowa, is called Annapurna, which literally means full of food. So Anna is the food level. That's the gross physical body. Pranamaya kosha is subtler than that. It's the life force. Prana is what keeps us healthy. Two people can come out of the doctor's office having had an x-ray, and the doctor will look at the x-ray, and one of the people will, basically the same x-ray, one of the people will be in a wheelchair and the other person will be walking around seemingly completely normal. That's because the normal one has a strong prana. The life force is making them healthy, even though their bodies may be aging or whatever. Manamaya kosha is the mind, the discursive thinking. And now the subtlest level of the mind is actually the intellect, Vijnanamaya kosha. And Anandamaya kosha is the ego. Ananda is bliss. When the ego is in a healthy state, it's a source of bliss. Now, Maharishi, in a lecture from 1980, said that when we transcend transcendental consciousness, when we transcend during our TM meditation practice, we experience samadhi. We're immersed in the pure consciousness. That's samadhi, transcendental experience. I was thrilled, Maharishi said, when I read this in Gaudapada's Karika commentary so many years ago, that the mind in samadhi does not get extinct, it expands. And this is Maharishi's view about samadhi and mahasamadhi, which is death of the body. It's not an extinction. The individuality expands when one is in cosmic consciousness or beyond and has overcome the constraints of karma. There is expansion into the subtler domains, celestial domains, and ultimately unity with Brahman, which is what we are. Prachara satu vigaya, the mind in samadhi expand. So this would be Maharishi's answer to Nachiketas. And thereby he establishes Brahmi consciousness, Brahmi Chaitanya, not a state of transcendence. It's interesting, Maharishi chose the word transcendental meditation, but it can have a connotation of merging or annihilation, which is not what Maharishi intended. It's a state of expanded awareness, thereby implying the practicality of action and behavior and experience. Very thorough and most profound in that state of Brahman consciousness, where the mind is expanded. It doesn't get extinct, it gets expanded. The jiva is the individual soul, becomes Brahman. It doesn't mean the jiva gets lost and extinct, but it only expands. It's the expansion of individuality which is desired of the state of Vedanta. So that's Maharishi's perspective. General philosophical perspectives. Here's Plato on reincarnation and innate knowledge. This is from the dialogue The Meno. Someone would not seek what he knows. He's talking about knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? Someone would not seek what he knows, for since he knows it, there's no need of the inquiry, nor what he does not know. For in that case, he does not even know what he is looking for. Thus, the soul, since it is immortal and has been born many times and has seen all things both here and in the other world, has learned everything that is. So we need not be surprised if it can recall the knowledge of virtue or anything else which it once possessed. For seeking and learning are in fact nothing but recollection. Notice the difference here in Plato's understanding and the materialist. The materialist thinks all knowledge comes to us through the senses. For Plato, profound knowledge is recollection of what we already know. It's an inner experience. It's not an outward investigation. In fact, Immanuel Kant has a very similar understanding to Plato, as we'll see. And science is not so much investigating out in the world for what the laws of nature, those laws of nature are already inherent in our own consciousness. What science is doing is refining our understanding of what's already in. So it's self-knowledge. Science is self-knowledge. Progress in science is getting clear about what's already inherent in our own consciousness. Pure consciousness in Plato. I suppose the soul reasons most beautifully when none of these things give her pain, neither hearing nor sight nor grief nor any pleasure. When instead, bidding farewell to the body, she comes to be herself all by herself as much as possible, and when doing everything she can to avoid communing with or even being in touch with the body. So rather than the body producing consciousness and mind, as the materialist supposes, the body is, if anything, it's a hindrance. It filters out higher consciousness. Here's the analysis of experience from the materialist's perspective. There's a source of illumination, in this case, the sun. The light from the sun falls on the object of perception, in this case, the flower. The light is reflected into the eye of the observer, stimulates the optic nerve, which goes to the visual cortex in the back of the brain. And then here the neuroscientist's story gets a little vague, but this call out bubble is supposed to somehow, this neural activity in the brain produces a representation in our mind that corresponds to the object of perception out in the world. This is the materialist story. Well, there are a lot of bad ideas. Here, this poor guy thought it would be a cute idea to pick up this little baby bear. Not a very smart idea. Turns out that materialism is not a great idea. Now, materialism was known about in ancient times. Here's from Plato's Phaedo. Let's see if I can move this out of the way. Oops. From the Phaedo. So here's Socrates. The body is held together, and he's describing the materialist picture of reality. The body is held together at a certain tension between the extremes of hot and cold and wet and dry and so on. And our soul is a temperament or adjustment of these same extremes when they are combined in just the right proportion. Well, if the soul is really an adjustment, obviously, as soon as the tension of our body is lowered or increased beyond the proper point, the soul must be destroyed, divine though it is, just like any other adjustment, either in music or in any product of the arts and crafts. Although in each case the physical remains last considerably longer until they are burned up or rot away. So this would be the materialist's answer to Nachiketas, that the soul is just an adjustment of the body. As long as the body is kept, the blood is circulating, the heart is beating, the neurons are firing. So in its right proportion, just like a musical instrument, when it's in the right tuning, it can create the music that the body can create our consciousness and cognition. This is the materialist story. Contemporary materialism. Here's Daniel Dennett in his book Consciousness Explained. Dennett is a prominent materialist, and he could have titled his book Consciousness Explained Away. The prevailing wisdom, variously expressed and argued for, is materialism. There is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. Now, one problem is that most materialist philosophers don't know very much physics, and the physics they have in mind is undergraduate classical mechanics. They don't realize that physics has moved beyond the materialist paradigm, and the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. According to materialists, we can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity. So here he lists a few physical phenomena: radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. This is the materialist perspective. Here's Jaegwon Kim, who was one of my professors at Johns Hopkins. The general idea, now here he's critiquing the idea that the soul has its own integrity. So the general idea is that because each of us has a soul, we are the kind of conscious, intelligent, and rational creature we are. Strictly speaking, we do not really have souls, since we are, in an important sense, identical with our souls. That is, each of us is a soul. My soul is the thing that I am. Each of us has a mind. Therefore, he's using mind and soul interchangeably here. Therefore, because each of us is a mind. All that is probably a bit too speculative, if not totally fantastical, for most of us to swallow. By most of us, he obviously is not thinking of anybody with a spiritual framework. He's thinking of his materialist colleagues. More materialism. Here's Owen Flanagan, The Problem of the Soul. The mind or the soul is the brain, or better, consciousness, cognition, and volition are perfectly natural capacities of fully embodied creatures engaged in complex commerce with the natural and social environments. Humans possess no special capacities, no extra ingredients that could conceivably do the work of the mind, the soul, or free will as traditionally conceived. Note that the materialist is assuming that the physical domain is causally closed. Causally closed means there's nothing outside of the gross physical realm that could influence it. But this is a metaphysical add-on, it's not science. But what exactly is wrong with materialism anyway? Well, first, there's the explanatory gap problem. Rajaram has been talking a lot about the hard problem of consciousness. It was understood for a long time that there's an explanatory gap between neurons firing in the brain and the fact of our subjective experience. Neuroscience can study every single neuron in the brain, maybe not anytime soon, but maybe in 100 years, we'll know what every neuron does in a person's brain and how it triggers the next neuron to fire and a whole sequence that goes throughout the brain in a chain reaction. Maybe someday neuroscience will get so sophisticated that it knows what every neuron does and how it affects every other neuron in the brain, but we still won't have explained the fact of our subjective experience. We can explain how the neurons make the muscles contract and make us move around and run and walk and talk and all those things that the body does. But how does that explain subjective experience? There's an explanatory gap between what neuroscience is studying and discovering and the fact of subjective experience. But there's an even harder problem of consciousness, which I want to talk about today. Materialism is not only wrong, it's conceptually incoherent. Conceptually incoherent, what do you mean? Okay, I came across this argument when I was an undergraduate studying Kant. And one of Kant's books is called The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. And in a footnote, Kant has this very brief paragraph. And when I read it, to tell you the truth, I didn't understand it when I first read it. Kant is notoriously difficult to understand. But when I thought about it and I got my professor to help me understand what he was saying, it hit me like a lightning bolt. Kant had put his finger on an irrefutable problem for materialism. Here's what Kant said. We cannot possibly conceive of a reason. By a reason, he means us. We're capable of reasoning, thinking, cognition. We cannot possibly conceive. There's a paradox in conceiving of a reason as being consciously directed from outside in regard to its judgments. In other words, if we came to believe, if we came to conceive of ourselves as being directed from outside, means something outside of the spiritual domain, if our cognition was directed by neurons firing in the brain, say, with regard to our judgments, our cognition, our thinking, our logic, For in that case, the subject would attribute the determination of his power of judgment not to his reason, but to an impulsion. It would seem like our thoughts were being dictated by something outside of the cognitive domain that couldn't care less whether our judgments were true or not, or whether our reasoning was logical or not. If the materialists were right and our cognition is determined, directed by neurons firing in the brain, well, those neurons are governed by physical laws, not by any necessity to make our cognition correspond to reality, by making our reason corresponding to logic. Reason must look upon itself as the author of its own principles, independently of alien influences. This argument is dynamite for the materialist. Now, William James took the argument a step farther. William James was writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and Darwinian evolution was the big breakthrough of the day in science. James emphasized its inconsistency with evolutionary theory. By evolutionary theory, he means Darwinian natural selection, that creatures evolve biologically in order to survive and to propagate the species. They have to get out of the way of danger, they have to find food, they have to reproduce. James posited that if consciousness were merely a byproduct of neural processes devoid of causal efficacy, it would not have been favored by natural selection. See the point? If the materialist were right that cognition is just a passive byproduct, then natural selection would not select for truth, for valid cognition. Automaton theory, the idea that we're just robots, nowadays computers, makes consciousness a mere supernumerary, just a byproduct. It doesn't do anything, as little able to affect the organism's destiny as the blush upon its cheek or the shadow cast by its form. James argued that if consciousness had no impact on behavior or any physical processes, then the contents of our consciousness, our awareness of the world, and our cognition would not have been shaped by evolution to correspond to reality. Consequently, the likelihood that our cognitive faculties reliably represent the world would be essentially zero. It would be a sheer miracle if any of our cognition were true. So here I dressed up the argument with some graphics. The nervous system has evolved to support the organism's ability to survive and reproduce. When there's danger, we either fight or run away. Here we're running away. The nervous system has evolved to support the organism's ability to survive and reproduce. That's why the neurons in the brain fire the way they do, to make the muscles contract, to get us out of danger, to find food, and so forth. The content of our cognition, since it's causally inefficacious, is just a passive byproduct of neurons firing. It doesn't do anything in its own. Our cognition would be irrelevant to survival and would not have been selected for survival. The neurons would evolve for physical reasons, to get us out of the way of danger. If our contents of our cognition corresponded to reality in any way whatsoever, it would be a sheer accident. Essentially, the likelihood that our cognition corresponds to reality would be vanishingly close to zero. The nervous system has evolved to support the organism's ability to survive and reproduce, but the cognitive content of our thoughts is irrelevant. One of the most articulate proponents of this realization is Alvin Plantinga. He wrote a book, which is a fabulous book. Plantinga was the foremost philosopher of religion. I don't know if he's still living. I corresponded with him about 20 years ago, and we were thinking very much alike. Here's the question. What reason is there for supposing that the belief content is true? There isn't any from the materialist perspective. The neurology causes adaptive behavior and also causes or determines belief content. But there's no reason to suppose that the belief content thus determined is true. All that's required for survival and fitness is that the neurology cause adaptive behavior, running away from danger, foraging for food. This neurology also determines belief content, but whether or not that content is true makes no difference to fitness of the organism for survival. Oops, that's a big problem for materialism. You have to pay attention to what you're doing in philosophy as well as in auto mechanics. The main point, materialism is conceptually incoherent. It's not just incorrect, it's fundamentally self-contradictory. It undermines its own foundations. The materialist thinks he's arguing in the name of science, that he's the epitome of rationality and logic. And here he has a theory which undermines the validity of any of our cognition and our cognitive content. So materialism undermines its own foundations. It's not just incorrect, it's fundamentally self-contradictory. Attempting to explain consciousness through materialism is like trying to understand waves without recognizing the ocean that gives rise to them. Just as the ocean is the silent source of all its waves, the dynamic expressions of consciousness emerge from the unbounded, self-interacting field of pure consciousness, the unified source of all knowledge in existence. Well, Eckhart, it must be getting late there. This is only about a 10% of my lecture. Do you want to pause and we can pick up again in a few weeks?
You can continue as you like.
All right, I'll continue a little longer.
But just to summarize, what you are saying is that the idea that matter is all there is, or I think the idea that matter is all there is okay, but then it would be without consciousness.
Yeah.
And
If the materialist thinks, yeah, there are stronger forms of materialism which try to argue that consciousness is an illusion,
yes,
and that matter is all there is. There are other forms of materialism which are not quite as nonsensical,
yeah,
which say that, yes, we have subjective experience, but it's a passive byproduct of the brain. What's fundamental is matter. But any form of materialism is going to run into this self-undermining problem. It undermines the validity of our reasoning, of our cognition. So there's what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, which is there's an explanatory gap. No matter how sophisticated our neuroscience gets, it won't have explained the fact of subjective experience. And what I call the harder problem of consciousness is that materialism undermines its own foundation because it undermines the legitimacy of reason itself, cognition itself, which undermines whatever arguments the materialist puts forward. Why take them seriously if there are sense that he's making sense is just a function of neurons firing?
So I have a favorite quote, Hermann von Helmholtz, a great physicist.
Yes.
He said that materialism is a nice model of the world because it's so successful, but still it's only a model. And if you forget that it's a model, then it becomes a dogma.
Yeah.
I think
Exactly.
that's what's happening to many physicists or many scientists.
Exactly.
Because it's such a successful model of the world, with only these tiny problems, it can't explain consciousness.
Exactly. Exactly.
And therefore, it becomes a dogma.
Yeah.
Um, then there are this philosophers who say consciousness is an illusion because they can't find consciousness in the material world. Then they think it's an illusion, which is sort of crazy because the only thing you know for real is your own consciousness. And
Yeah.
the only thing that you know is really that's this argument by Descartes that
Yeah.
the only thing what is real is your experience, your personal experience. All the other things can be made up, and
Yeah.
and then you believe. Then you do the other way around. You think that what is really real is an illusion, and you believe in that what you can't see.
Yeah.
That's materialism. Okay, so now we had our first part, and you explained that when you think it through, then this idea that matter is all there is inconsistent. It's only
Yeah.
consistent as long as you believe that consciousness is not there. But since
Right.
consciousness is our experience and it's there, then you have a problem. And
Yeah.
this, as David Sharma says, it's a hard problem.
Yes.
Um,
So
but now, what
why?
is your solution for the problem?
Yeah. Why is materialism the dominant paradigm? And as Eckhart just mentioned, it's become a dogma. It's become a dogma, almost a quasi-religious dogma. I mean, it's not really religious because it doesn't believe in God, but it's like a religion. The first dogma, there's two dogmas that I want to draw attention to. The first dogma, which materialists draw attention, is neurological impairment implies production. Production is another word for materialism, that the brain produces consciousness and cognition, that these are products of the brain, that the idea that the soul could be immortal and outlive the death of the body um, makes no sense according to the materialist. The fact and what the materialist does is he draws attention to neurological impairment. If you get hit on the head, you lose consciousness. If you drink a cup of coffee, you become more alert. So there are obvious instances of dependence of the quality of our consciousness on the state of our brain functioning. Caffeine promotes wakefulness. Anesthesia and traumatic brain injury can suppress or abolish conscious experience. But it does not follow that this dependence is universal in the strong metaphysical sense presupposed by materialism, much less that dependence entails production, the idea that the brain produces consciousness and cognition. Materialism generalizes from often depends on to always produced by, and then treats that generalization as a scientific conclusion rather than a metaphysical extrapolation. This argument is often presented as an incredulous challenge. If mind were anything over and above the brain, why would brain injury matter? Paul Churchland, a famous materialist, offers a representative expression appealing to, quote, enormous mass of neurophysiological data as if it establishes, quote, beyond any serious doubt that mind is produced by the brain and that consciousness is epiphenomenal. Epiphenomenal means it's a passive byproduct. It doesn't have any causal, consciousness and cognition don't have any causal efficacy of their own. The underlying suggestion is that familiar patterns of dependence of conscious function on neural integrity decisively support a production theory according to which the brain generates consciousness and cognition, but this inference is a non sequitur. It doesn't follow logically. From the premise that brain states and consciousness states co-vary, of course, the brain affects our conscious experience. It doesn't follow that consciousness and cognition are passive byproducts produced by the brain. It does not follow that the brain generates consciousness. The same evidence is compatible with at least two broad model families. The production model is the materialist model. Consciousness and cognition are wholly brain produced and have no autonomous existence independent of neural activity. On this view, conscious experience and thought content are epiphenomenal, mere byproducts of neural processes, and have no causal efficacy of their own. In contrast, there's the transmission or filter model. So I referred to William James and Frederick Myers, but an even deeper form of transition or filter model is the Vedic tradition. Brain activity does not generate consciousness, it mediates, constrains, and filters a more fundamental consciousness into ordinary waking experience. It may be that the brain's primary function is to filter out higher consciousness, and that when we quiet the brain down is when deeper consciousness, deeper awareness comes forth unconstrained. In the version of the transmission model I prefer, the nervous system has two characteristic styles of functioning. One, it functions as a filter that attenuates higher consciousness, subtle experience, refined intuition, and expanded awareness, so that awareness is narrowed to the practical demands of waking life. So the brain does two things. It filters out higher consciousness. Second, it functions as a comparatively rudimentary computational system, a relatively crude biological computer that supports analytic discursive thought. So what I'm suggesting is that the brain has two functions. One, it filters out high consciousness. And second, it says, okay, I've taken away your supernormal abilities, your cities, your capacity for intuitive cognition. And here, I'll give you a consolation prize. The brain can function as a rudimentary neural network, a primitive computer. There, so you should be happy. The second mode can be increasingly externalized and in many tasks outstripped by artificial intelligence, highlighting that analysis and computation are valuable yet limited instruments, distinct from and in important respects inferior to creative intelligence. So I'm all for AI. It's a great tool, but it's not creative intelligence. It's not a computer is, as John Hagelin likes to say, a computer is as dead as a doornail. Analytical cognition is a limited substitute for intuition rather than its foundation. Thus, Maharishi used to say that at its best, we can think without steps. That's intuition, just immediate cognition. Thus, the familiar instances of neurological dependence establish at most the conditions under which consciousness is normally expressed in embodied life. The second dogma, this has been around certainly since the time of Descartes, probably before, the idea that mental causation violates physics. The mind can't have any cognitive powers. It must be just an epiphenomenon, because if the mind could intervene in the brain functioning, it would violate conservation of energy or some other physical principle. If the physical domain is assumed to be causally closed, in other words, the only things that can affect something in the physical domain is another physical process or procedure, that's what it is for the physical domain to be causally closed. There's no causes outside the physical domain. And constrained by conservation laws, then mind cannot be causally efficacious. It cannot influence neurophysiology or anything else physical without adding energy and thereby violating conservation. Therefore, the materialist contends mental causation is scientifically impossible, and consciousness must be epiphenomenal, doing no causal work of its own. This is the second dogma. It's very influential if you study philosophy of mind from the materialist perspective. It's all over the literature. This objection is often delivered with an air of finality. Daniel Dennett states it sharply. Non-physical directives would carry no physical energy or mass, and thus could not alter neural trajectories without violating conservation laws. Mental causation on this view faces an inescapable and fatal law. But this line of reasoning quietly slides from a legitimate constraint in physics into a metaphysical postulate, namely that the physical domain is causally closed. Who said so? That's the Vedic insight. There is a whole subtle domain, and mind, intellect, ego are called the subtle body. Prana, mind, intellect, ego. They're the subtle body because they do interact with the gross physical body. Alvin Plantinga's reply captures the key point. Conservation laws apply to closed systems. If mind genuinely intervenes, then the relevant system is not closed in the relevant sense, and no contradiction follows. Dogma 2, therefore, does not refute mental causation. It merely restates the assumption of causal closure and calls it physics. Causal closure is not itself a finding of physics, it's a philosophical stipulation. If closure is treated as a metaphysical certainty, materialism is smuggled into the premises of the debate and then paraded as the conclusion. The physics invoked by materialists is tacitly classical. Now, we could pause here, Eckhart, because most materialist philosophers haven't studied advanced physics, and they don't know that what their idea of physics is billiard ball physics, which is out of date by more than 100 years. And this is exciting for me personally because that's what MIU's physics department is all about. We're studying physics at the deepest level, the level at which consciousness creates matter. I believe that very powerful advances are going to come out of our department and our school, and it will impact the world of science in a way that makes artificial intelligence seem like child's play.
Can you
Shall
give
we
a
talk?
can you give a hint what you think will be the breakthrough?
Well, we start by looking at, actually, this is not new. We start with a graduate course in classical mechanics,
Mm-hmm.
and graduate classical mechanics. This was known by mostly French philosophers in the 1700s, Lagrange, Maupertuis. Many people have heard of it in the principle of least time,
Mm-hmm.
that light from a source like a light bulb or a candle or the sun,
Mm-hmm.
if it goes from one medium to another, like goes through air and then through water, its speed will change. And at a detector, it will go in a way that minimizes the time. So instead of like billiard ball undergraduate physics, this happens, then this happens, then this happens,
Mm-hmm.
a chain reaction like that, localized in space and time at every point, you know the beginning and you know the end, and nature picks out the path of least time. This is part of a broader principle called the principle of least action.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, that was known a long time ago, and for a while there was a debate. The materialism became the predominant paradigm mainly because it was just the collective consciousness
Mm-hmm.
didn't support higher understanding. Um, Now, in electromagnetism, there was a very great scientist named Michael Faraday.
Mm-hmm.
Faraday was an experimentalist and very spiritual man. He belonged to a small sect. It was kind of like the Quakers, very peaceful oriented. Um, and he brought his religious convictions into his science, and he came up with the idea of the field as you have electrical phenomena, you have magnetic phenomena, and he said these are both manifestations of an underlying unified field. And electromagnetism is actually the first unified field theory, unifying phenomena that on the surface appear very different, but are actually both expressions. Now, if you have in undergraduate classical mechanics, you think of energy and momentum as belonging to a moving object. You have a billiard ball moving along, it has kinetic energy and it has momentum. But in electromagnetism, in graduate course in electromagnetism, that energy is radiated out and stored in the field. This is very different than the way Daniel Dennett thinks of conservation laws. And and there are anomalies with our understanding of space, time, matter, and causation. For example, if you have a moving electric charge, you have an accelerating charge, it radiates off energy. That energy is stored in the field. And then because every action has an equal and opposite reaction, there's something called the radiation reaction force back on the moving
Mm-hmm.
particle from the field. Now, the anomaly is that the particle starts to feel the radiation reaction force before it starts to move in the first place. This suggests that our understanding of time is seriously incomplete.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the anomalies. Now, these anomalies get more pronounced when you get to quantum mechanics because you have quantum entanglement. Everybody has heard of particles that have interacted and then they go their separate ways. they remain entangled. So if you make a measurement on one and it collapses the wave function, it automatically collapses its partner, no matter how far away it is. What not everybody realizes is that this entanglement is across time also. So space, time, matter, causation are much more sophisticated than the simplistic idea, waking state idea that that most materialist philosophers have in mind when they talk about physics.